I'm recording this because I feel that, in a sense, the Australia that I knew and loved just died yesterday. Actually, it didn't die. It was murdered by treasonous politicians and lobby groups. The Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism legislation, which passed Parliament yesterday, shatters no less than 4 of our foundational legal and political principles. I'm going to name these in a moment and explain why this is such a massive deal for everyone. The reason government tyranny rarely happened in Australia was because of legal and political principles which had developed in the mother country for centuries and continued here because the people believed in them. The Multicultural Brigade, who want to replace Australians with others from non-British or European backgrounds, insist that all we need to do is to keep those ideals and principles. It didn't occur to them, or they wouldn't admit, that different peoples would actually have different ideals and principles. Yesterday, the federal parliament passed the Combating Anti-Semitism, Hate and Extremism legislation. Despite the title, the bill doesn't adequately define anti-Semitism, hate or extremism. In other words, these concepts will likely depend on the government to decide what they are. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but it should terrify you. That's because the government now has the power to define these terms how they like. This will be so open to abuse that it's quite possible, in my opinion, that they'll be able to prosecute people they don't like, with up to 15 years in jail. The real poison in this bill, however, is that, as I said, it smashes no less than 4 of the founding principles of British governance, which have held sway in this nation since its founding. The first principle it smashes is that of free speech, a centuries-old British tradition. This principle holds that any citizen is entitled to express any opinion without fear of punishment by the state. There are some exceptions around incitement to violence, defamation, or other forms of speech which would lead to immediate and quantifiable harm. Unfortunately, as is the case nowadays, citizens are prevented from criticising powerful groups or their members who are protected by the government. Of course, the government doesn't refer to these people as powerful groups. It refers to them as protected groups, implying that they're protected due to powerlessness and vulnerability. In reality, the only groups protected are the ones who can heavy the government through either ethnic bloc voting, campaign contributions, control of media narratives, or having compromising photos involving a particularly attractive goat. I'm joking about that last one, of course. For example, much to their consternation, the LGBTQ+ crowd were left out of the legislation. They just didn't have time to deploy enough political capital to be included going forward. If they can exert enough influence on the government, they will be added to the protected categories. That won't depend on vulnerability, it will depend on how much political power they can deploy. I've spoken incessantly about this, but I'll just quote George Washington, who in 1783 said, "If the freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led, like sheep to the slaughter. Welcome to the abattoir." The second principle this bill smashes is the freedom of association. Under this principle, people should be free to associate or not associate with whomever they please. Freedom of association usually includes the right to form groups like political parties, unions, clubs, charities, and religious groups, and join or not join these groups. To organise collectively, which means the right to meet, campaign, advocate, and protest. To pursue shared ideas or interests, including, and this is a big one, unpopular or minority views. It protects collective expression and recognises that many rights, such as speech, religion, political participation, and so on, are weak unless people can exercise them together. There are limits to the freedom of association. It generally does not protect groups formed to commit crimes or violence or that coerce membership. It doesn't protect conduct that independently violates criminal law. But still, governments can restrict association only when it's necessary and proportionate, such as to prevent serious crime or terrorism. Why does it matter? Well, firstly, democracy. Political parties, advocacy groups, unions, and civil society depend on it. We've already seen a nascent political party disband in fear. Whatever your thoughts on the White Australia Party, the shutting down of a political party should terrify you. Secondly, free speech. A lot of ideas are expressed collectively rather than individually. And thirdly, and this is a big one, minority protection. Vulnerable or unpopular groups rely on association to be heard. And lastly, it acts as a check on power. That means that organised groups can challenge the state more effectively than individuals. Your elected representatives just threw that all out of the window yesterday. You no longer have that right. The government can lock you up for even associating with a group they don't like. What could go wrong? The next vital principle the politicians just destroyed is the rule of law. Under British Commonwealth tradition, laws are set out clearly and they are applied to everyone equally by the courts. This is called fairness. Everyone is treated the same. At least that's the goal. Politicians didn't get to punish those with whom they disagree or dislike. Once this bill's passed into law, however, it'll hand sweeping power to the powerful politicians to prosecute those people or organisations that they don't like. Even worse, it blatantly removes fairness from the process. The latest form of the bill that I can find online states that in section 114.4.a, a person does not need to have been convicted of a hate crime in order for the AFP minister to be satisfied that an organisation has engaged in conduct of a kind mentioned in paragraph 1a. No procedural fairness required. It continues. The AFP minister is not required to observe any requirements of procedural fairness in deciding whether or not the AFP minister is satisfied for the purpose of this section. They decide, no ifs or buts, total power to do what they want depending on how they feel at that exact moment. And lastly, if poor old George Orwell isn't spinning in his grave fast enough, the final legal principle which has been abolished by this bill is the idea of retroactive application. The government in what we call civilised countries are not permitted to pass laws which criminalise past behaviour. When they passed laws mandating seatbelts, they were not allowed to prosecute people who had previously travelled in cars without a seatbelt, obviously. Once again, this bill tramples all over that. In section 114.a.4, the draft bill states that conduct constituting a hate crime may have occurred before commencement. That presumably means before coming into law. It then states that a reference to conduct constituting a hate crime that occurred before subsection 1 commences. I'll repeat that. It says that, quote, conduct constituting a hate crime that occurred before subsection 1 commences. This applies to organisations, but organisations are made up of human beings. Laws which are enforced retroactively set a terrifying precedent. This legislation may be subject to legal challenges, but from what I've seen of recent judicial decisions, I'm not holding out much hope that the entire bill will be struck down as it should. The only hope is that we can elect better politicians who will abolish it soon, and we must grow organisations which can educate people and oppose this tyranny while we still can. In the meantime, I'm now expecting that I'll go to prison at some point. I don't know what excuse they'll make, but I'm sure they'll come up with something. I'm intending to speak at rallies in Brisbane and the Gold Coast on Australia Day. Let's hope I don't get arrested or disappeared before then. I'll see you there if you can make it. In the meantime, join the British Australian community and subscribe to our socials while you still can. We need you and we need your support. Thank you.